Welcome to the 1CA podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. 1CA is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, and field agents to discuss their experiences on ground with the partner nation's people and leadership. Our goal is to inspire anyone interested in working the last 3 feet of foreign relations. To contact the show, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com or look us up on the Civil Affairs Association website at www.civilaffairsassoc.org. I'll have those in the show notes. Today we welcome Sam Cooper, founder of the news outlet The Bureau, as he interviews Christopher Meyer, a former U.S. official and China expert during the Bush 1 and 2 administrations. Meyer currently serves as the head of the U.S. Micronesia Council and is the founder of Wide Fountain, a platform for in-depth geopolitical analysis. This is the first of a 2-part episode. Sam and Christopher discuss PRC strategic corruption and political warfare. So let's get started.
Today, I'm excited to introduce Chris Myers. Chris is a longtime China expert and former U.S. government diplomatic and economic issues officer, and he explains how military intelligence and influence networks embedded deeply with organized crime are a central feature of the global strategy employed by the families that really are running communist China. And when I say that, we're going to discuss your research on the family of Xi Jinping, the Xi family, and you call it the Yezi clique. But first, tell our viewers your background in getting into China and your career.
Thank you very much, Sam. I started a keen interest in China when I was 16. And I read the history of the Opium Wars and I was outraged. And I decided I wanted a career to be involved in business and diplomacy between the U.S. and China. And then as an undergrad student, I did research on the special economic zones. This was in the early 80s, and the special economic zones were just announced, and my research led me to see the geopolitical aspects. There were some across from Macau, across from Hong Kong, and across from Taiwan. So I sort of had an eye to that. And then I did business. For 5 years, I was with a Fortune 500 company. And I had the opportunity to do some business in Xiaomon, and I saw some things that set off alarm bells in my mind. And I kind of filed that, but I had some experiences that informed my research later. I worked in the government in Bush 1 and Bush 2. I was involved in Indo Pacific affairs and really helping American companies do business in the region, and then became a consultant to part of the government that administered our territories in the Pacific. So I saw some things there that, again, set off alarm bells in my mind. And in 2016, I happened across an old colleague who kind of gave me some more information. And basically from 2016 until 2022, I conducted a lot of independent research. I decided I wanted to know exactly what was going on because proxies in the region seemed emboldened to take on the U.S. And they didn't have a government portfolio, but they acted like they did. And so my research sort of started in Micronesia. I had the great opportunity to come across your book. You totally informed parts of what I was looking at and kind of put the spotlight on what happened in Canada. And I kind of worked the two sides to the middle and conducted most recently research that kind of takes us from Mao Zedong's death until the 90s. And I believe that there was a clique, I call it the Yezi clique. There were scores to settle. There were powerful families that were on the cusp of greatness or recognition for all their good work, and they were purged. And it led some individuals to become extremely militant in their conduct of political warfare against the U.S. So that sort of sets the table for what we might be talking about.
Yeah, so to get into this, let's start with the Ye family. They're mysterious, but for experts, they're very clearly a clan that has tremendous king-making power in China. So maybe let's start with who they are and then bridge into how they connect with Xi's father.
So the patriarch Ye Jianying was literally the kingmaker of Mao Zedong. He came from Guangdong province, and he was involved in the very earliest movements of the Communist Party in China. And he fled one of those, I think it was the Guangzhou uprising, with Zhou Enlai, and they escaped to Hong Kong. So Ye Jianying is one of the original revolutionaries in China, and he had the title Marshal Ye. And when he crossed paths with Mao Zedong, he was actually the aide-de-camp to a very powerful Communist Party operator out of Beijing, who had an army of tens of thousands. And he rolled up to Mao and his very small group of long marchers and said, "Follow us, we're going to Sichuan province." And Mao was like, "No, I don't think that's a safe bet. The locals are going to tear you up." And Ye Jianying kind of heard a truth in Mao, and he deserted this powerful general, and with him brought the code books. So Mao gets Ye Jianying and the code books, and he's able to communicate with the Comintern. And lo and behold, that general did get wiped out in Sichuan. He returned to Mao's base with a few thousand troops. From then, Mao became the most powerful leader in the communist ecosystem. So Ye Jianying had a very high regard for Mao. Mao called him the savior of the Communist Party and the Communist Revolution. And so fast forward it right through the revolution, Ye gets a very top position as the party secretary for Guangdong province. It's the largest and economically most powerful province in the country. And Mao wants to conduct his land reform in Guangdong, just as he does everywhere. And it's a violent thing where landowners are hunted down and put to death. Ye, because he was a native Cantonese, understood that the landowners in Guangdong were not of the same ilk as those throughout China. They actually worked the lands. They had a very cooperative relationship with labor, and he tried to resist. But Mao forced Lin Biao into Guangdong, and Ye lost his government role. And if he hadn't been in the military, he would have been completely out of power. But because he had a military portfolio, he was able to stay on the peripheries, and he was actually part of the small group that brought down the Gang of Four and ended the Cultural Revolution. So Ye Jianying went through the Mao Zedong grinder, but he did it so early in the 50s that he was able to maintain power and have it going forward. Another Long March hero was Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping. And his claim to fame in the Communist Party was he maintained security over the area where Mao was camped in Yan'an. And he was able to provide Mao and his group with enough security that they could camp there through a winter and survive. And not only that, but he negotiated and he conducted diplomacy with the tribesmen in the Northwest, in Qinghai, in Xinjiang, and in Tibet. And he was loved. And he got a lot of rebels and insurgents among these minority populations to join the Communist Party. And Mao gave him great props for that and referred to him as one of the heroes of the Three Kingdoms period. Another brilliant statesman who was able to ingratiate with the minorities and make them part of the Chinese nation. Unfortunately, though, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, he was purged, but he was purged later. He was purged in 1962. And from Xi Jinping's age 9 until he was 25, Xi Jinping's father was under arrest without trial. It was just the Cultural Revolution. He was under arrest because his office published a book that was deemed not flattering to Mao Zedong. Basically, it was promoting some thought within the Communist Party that Mao didn't like. So Xi's father is in jail from 62 to 78. And because Ye Sr. and Xi Jinping had a relationship, Ye Jianying kind of became a godfather of sorts for Xi Jinping. She was sent to work in the countryside, and he escaped, and he tried to get back to Beijing, and it wasn't safe for him to be reunited with his family. And Ye intervened, and Ye made sure that she joined the Communist Party, even though these tragedies were all around him, and made sure that he got the semblance of an education, although he really never did. He was a guide for Xi Jinping throughout his younger years in place of his father.
Before we continue how those families dovetail together, can you describe in China's political economy, what is the power of Marshal Ye?
So in the 50s, he was jettisoned out of the political arena. His main work was in the PLA. He was a marshal, and he became Minister of Defense in China. And he was responsible for procurement. And to sort of give you a sense, when the Korean War started, the United Nations put a blockade on trade with China because they were arming the North Korean army. Marshal Ye was responsible for making sure that supplies got to North Korea. And that was a big role that he fulfilled. And his sons kind of brought that along. So it's curious because Marshal Ye was one of the most powerful stars in the communist lineup, but he was also a minority. He was from Guangdong and he was a Hakka Chinese. So some people would say that Hakka Chinese within China, there's a lid sometimes on their ability to move up. And so perhaps he was never considered for the echelon, but he did rise very high. But in some ways, and his sons adopted this even more so, they had to become very combative in their political dealings. But no doubt about it, Marshal Ye had a chance to handle huge volumes of military supplies, and there was an opportunity to skim and generate great wealth, which probably was the case. The way that Marshal Ye fulfilled the supply chains for the North Korean army was through organized crime. And it just happened that two of the individuals, Henry Falk and Stanley Ho, were also Hakka Chinese. And they became the kingpins of organized crime in Hong Kong and Macau. Both of them are on the record as saying they made their fortunes supplying the Korean War.
Right. So people that read my book are very familiar with Stanley Ho. According to U.S. government intelligence, the absolute king of Chinese international mafia with connectivity to casinos, banking, political influence operations in Canada, triad leadership in Canada. So I think we've set the table for the 90s in Guangdong, Fujian. Xi Jinping is now starting to come on the scene politically there. The Ye family, who were partners essentially of Xi's father, had a little bit of a godfather eye on Xi's movements within the party. We can say that they're the power behind a throne that they want to see continue to rise. So can you take us into the 90s, the sort of Stanley Ho connectivity to Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and how that combines the Hong Kong tycoons / triad leaders with the communist powers in Fujian?
Yes. Mao passed away in 78. Deng Xiaoping came to power, and Deng was all about economic reform and catching up to the West. So in southern China, Fujian and Guangdong province, Deng looked to Ye Jianying and his sons. His sons were in their 30s now. And he also looked to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping became party secretary for Guangdong province in the early 80s. And Deng kind of put together this group. And the Yes and the Xis were family friends. They celebrated Chinese holidays together. The Xis were northern Chinese, but they kind of encamped in Guangdong province after a certain amount of time. And that's where Xi's father retired. But in Guangdong, the son of Ye, his name was Ye Xuanping. Basically, he was the mayor of Guangzhou and the governor of Guangdong. And very quickly, he was referred to as the Emperor of the South. So in the 80s, he was running Guangdong province. And he became so powerful that the CCP sought to have him step down. And he actually threatened to withhold tax to Beijing from the province of Guangdong unless they negotiated with him. He wanted a vice chair of the CPPCC, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee. And he wants to be a vice governor of the CPPCC. And he wanted to be allowed to maintain his power base in Guangdong And this is a rare case where the CCP actually deferred to these wishes. Just to get him out of running the most powerful province in China, they said, okay. So he goes over to the CPPCC and he takes with him the kingpins of organized crime in Hong Kong and Macau. Stanley Ho never had a position, but Henry Falk and the other top lieutenants in these organized crime entities all wound up on the CPPCC. And to give you a sense of like what was some of the magic Stanley Ho had, when he won the monopoly on gaming in Macau, he devised this VIP room concept where he owned the casino, but the VIP rooms were run by basically triads and junkets, powerful friends from mainland China and triads. And the triads conducted all kinds of crime that the Vancouver model got in a very big dose. So it was racketeering and prostitution and all kinds of things, but also collections. So Stanley Ho didn't have to work on collections because his muscle did it for him. But the strongest of these triad operators wound up in the CPPCC, as long as they were effective in what they were doing for the government. And 14K is dominated by Hakka Chinese. Most of the most powerful triads have a very strong Hakka element to it. And I don't mean to suggest that this wonderful race of Chinese called Hakkas is all bad. Lee Kuan Yew, the premier of Singapore, was Hakka Chinese. There were some phenomenal Chinese, but there were also some very nefarious and very effective in their criminal activities that were Hakka Chinese. So the Yez were in the middle of this. And Chinese language social media accounts in Hong Kong will talk about the Yez dominance over these gaming operators in Macau.
Let's get into that and explore that more. I just want to ask a side question, as I'm aware of a very important figure in what we call the Hogue Commission in Canada. I'm just going to leave it at that. This is our inquiry into foreign interference that stemmed from my investigative reporting. And there's a politician at the center of that my sources close to them said went off to a Hakka conference in China for weeks or something like that, while being an elected politician in Canada. Knowing what you know, and I'm just coming out of the blue with this question, is there anything good for Canada that they could be doing on that trip?
There could be a lot of normal cultural activity, but I'll say one thing, that the powers that are doing the kinds of things that I'm concerned with are definitely represented in those groups. There might be a wink and a nod and things look very normal on the surface, but there's no free lunch in China. Everybody has to pay the piper, and the piper is the Communist Party of China.
So let me ask you this. Viewers of the Bureau know that I've pressed away in journalism in explaining that the United Front Work Department and international money laundering and organized crime are synonymous. They're one and the same. The CIA says the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference is really the core unit of the United Front. So what you're getting at, I think the Ye family, these power brokers that are behind Xi and his power in southern China, you're saying they essentially formed this United Front and organized crime compact as sort of a political tool, a smuggling tool, a military tool?
Yes, and I want to say that the United Front was an early Communist Party creation. And the thing about the Communist Party, they infiltrated the Kuomintang when the Kuomintang had more power and they were the power base in China. The communists used political warfare to infiltrate them and really become their undoing. And the United Front is basically one way to get all parts of society under the control of the CCP. So within the United Front, the CPPCC is sort of the big leagues. And all the other organizations are the feeder groups. So if you get in a small United Front group and you deliver in a big way, you can get promoted all the way to the CPCC. And Ong Lap Sung is an example of that. So the whole idea of the United Front is to harness and control all the resources from academia, the private sector, from all aspects of society and to make them work for the Communist Party. And I feel that any united front operation, and there's so many in Canada and the US, they should just be called assets of the Chinese government. That's one way for the Chinese to increase their headcount of diplomatic officers within any given country.
This is the end of part 1. Come back next week for the ongoing interview between Sam Cooper and Christopher Meyer. Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have the email and CA Association website in the show notes. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. One CA Podcast.